Today on Sports Central, we'll be going over next final prediction of this offseason, and it will be over the Texas Longhorns. And this is a team that went 8-5 in 2019, all around a decent season for this team. And of course, they're expected to be better than how they were, but they got Sam Ehlinger coming back, and honestly, for this Texas team that is returning a ton of talent coming into 2020, I think this is a team that could easily win the Big 12 next season, and that's what we're going over here today. We're going to be going over your returning prediction for the 2020 season, along with a full preview and a prediction on every game on Texas's schedule heading into 2020. So with that, let's look at your season trends for this team in 2019. Of course, they were 8-5 once again. They were 5-3 between September and October, and then they were 3-2 between November and the postseason. So they were a pretty consistent team all season long. Of course, I'd consider them to have probably the worst or the toughest Big 12 schedule all of last season, for that matter. Of course, they had to play LSU at the beginning of the season. They had to play them in week 2, so you had a tough game right off the bat, and then you also had a really tough Big 12 schedule in general. So, obviously this team had a tough go at it, but they had a couple of good wins in there. They were able to beat Oklahoma State 36-30. Also had a win against Kansas State 27-24. They had a blowout win against Texas Tech 49-24, and then they absolutely stunned Utah in their bowl game. I believe that was in the Alma Bowl. And they got the win there 38-10, not even close. I mean, considering how good Utah was last season, I mean, that was a crazy game. I mean, Utah was expected to win by a mile, and for Texas to come out of nowhere and just beat them up like that, very impressive win there for Texas, and I think that could help them a ton heading into the 2020 season. That gives them a ton of momentum for sure, and especially for Sam Ehlinger, which is a quarterback that I do expect to be a top 5 quarterback in the nation next season. That could be huge for him and for this team in general. As far as the return production goes, you return your quarterback Sam Ehlinger, obviously. Of course, he returns for his senior season. He could have gone into the NFL already, but good enough for Texas is that he's going to be able to return for his senior season. That's going to be huge. Of course, last season he had over 3,600 yards with 32 touchdowns and 10 interceptions. He also had a 65% completion rate, so he's a very accurate quarterback. He had a pretty good touchdown-interception ratio. Of course, I mean, 32-10, he definitely could improve that still, but overall, it's basically just over a 3-1, so he's definitely got a lot of room to improve there. They also returned their top running back, Ehlinger, which is going to be huge. He had just over 1,000 yards with 10 touchdowns last season. They also returned their second running back in Rashawn Johnson, which he had just right over 800 yards with 8 touchdowns last season. So, of course, their running backs combined for just right around 1,900 yards last season and 18 touchdowns. So, it's going to be huge for them to be able to return both of them. And of course, you also have Sam Ehlinger in there, who is a dual-threat quarterback. He put up nearly 700 yards of rushing alone last season with 7 touchdowns. So you got 3 really good rushers in there and in that offense next season. As far as the receiving core goes, you do take a couple of big hits. You lose your top wide receiver, Devin Duvernay, which, of course, he went to the NFL draft, and he got drafted pretty early on. He had 1,400 yards and 10 touchdowns last season, so that's going to be a tough loss there, obviously. Then you also lose your second receiver in Colin Johnson, which he had just right around 600 yards with 3 touchdowns. So overall, I mean, that's not all that terrible, I mean, for the second wide receiver. But the good thing is they do return their third receiver in Brendan Eagles, which, of course, I mean, he wasn't as good as Duvernay or Colin Johnson, but he also had 500 yards with 6 touchdowns. So he's still got a lot of potential in him as well. And you can't forget that this Texas team has got a good recruiting class coming in, so I'm sure they got a couple of good receivers along with that to be able to replace the receivers that they lost with Devin and Colin. So that's going to be good for them, especially. As far as the offensive line goes, you lose 2 there. You also lose 2 on the defensive line and 1 linebacker. You lose 1 in the secondary. So this defense loses 4 starters in general. So it's overall looking pretty good. I mean, the returning production for Texas is definitely very promising going into 2020. Brings up the question, is Texas a national contender? Of course, this team was really hyped up going into 2019. I mean, many people expected them to go 10-2, possibly 11-1 through the regular season, and it didn't really happen that way. They ended up only going 8-5, but still, I mean, for a Texas team that's got Sam Ehlinger and a lot of talent there, and a great recruiting class as well coming in, I think that they could definitely put up some big damage in the Big 12 next season. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me to see this team be similar to how maybe many people expected them to be in 2019. Where they could get to maybe 10 wins, and it wouldn't surprise me a single bit to see Texas make it to a pretty good bowl game. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me at all to see them make it to the Big 12 championship either. I mean, this team is definitely a big contender, I think, in the Big 12 to possibly win the title. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me a single bit. But as far as the cultural playoff goes, I'm not quite sure whether or not I would suggest that Texas has got a good chance at making the cultural playoff. I think if they do beat Oklahoma in the Big 12 championship, I think Texas would probably, if they've got a good record, they'd probably be a really good candidate to make it into the college football playoff. But once again, it's still very early on to be able to say that. Also brings up the question, chances of winning the Big 12 in 2020, I'd say your chances are pretty good. I'd say you're probably one of 3 teams that I definitely say are way up there, and those would include Texas, and you could also include Iowa State and Oklahoma in there. So those 3 teams I definitely think have the best shot to win the conference next season, and you can't even forget about Baylor and Oklahoma State too. I mean, both of those teams should definitely be good contenders as well. So yeah, with that, for Texas, chances of winning the Big 12 in 2020, I would say are actually pretty decent, as long as they can get past Oklahoma. As far as your schedule goes, you start off the season on September 5th against South Florida, and then you got a big game against LSU on the 12th, and that's going to be a very impactful game for the season for Texas. Of course, it kind of affected Texas negatively last season. Of course, they lost that game against LSU, and they ended up having a pretty rough season. So if they could get a win there, I think Texas could easily get up to 10, 11 wins. But if they do lose, that could set them off on the wrong foot, and it could give them more of a rough season. But who knows? I mean, that's still going to be a big game no matter what. You got UTEP at home the following week, and then in October you got Kansas State on the road, followed by Oklahoma. That's going to be a huge game. Watch out for that one there. And then you got West Virginia, Texas Tech, and Baylor to finish out the month. Then in your November, you got Kansas on the road, followed by TCU, Iowa State, and Oklahoma State. So all around, I mean, this schedule is not all that terribly tough for Texas next season. Of course, the Oklahoma game, once again, is just going to be that very, very impactful game for the season for Texas. And yeah, that Iowa State game too. I mean, you can't forget about that one at the end of November. Watch out for that one there as well. But here's what I'm expecting out of your September. I think that you go 2-1. I think you're going to win against South Florida and UTEP. Both of those games definitely Texas should get wins in. And of course, since they're highlighted in green, that means I expect them to win them pretty easily. I think the LSU game, though, it's just going to be too tough at that point in the season. I mean, I know LSU is losing Joe Burrow and they're losing a lot of talent, but still for Texas to be able to have to play in Death Valley, I mean, it's going to be a really tough place to play, and it always is, I mean, for that matter. And it's going to be a big game for both teams, and I think LSU is going to come into that game with a lot more experience, and I think they're going to be able to get a big win in general. If it was in Texas now, if it was in Arlington, I think Texas would have a good chance of getting a big win there against LSU. But I think with it, once again, being on the road, I just don't really like Texas's chances there. As far as your October goes, I think that you go 4-1 in this month. I think you get a win against Kansas State. And then that Oklahoma game, it's going to be, I mean, I went back and forth on that one a ton, but I think Oklahoma gets the win there. I think Oklahoma in general next season, I mean, they got great recruiting coming in, and then Spencer Rattler at their quarterback, he looks pretty good right now as well. Of course, he's a 5-star recruit in high school, so there's no doubt that he's going to be a good quarterback going into next season. And yeah, you got West Virginia and Texas Tech, of course, in the following weeks. I think those are also easy wins. And so going into that Baylor game to finish off the month, I think that you're going to go into that one 5-2 with 5 easy wins and 2 pretty tough losses. And I think you get a win against Baylor. I think that Baylor team is going to be not as good as it was last season, at least. And I think with Texas being at home and with a pretty good home field advantage, I think that's going to help them a ton. And I think Baylor next season, they do got Charlie Brewer, and they still have a decent amount of talent. But I think Texas in the end, I'm just more confident in this Texas team than I am with Baylor. So I'd give Texas the win there to finish off the month. So you go into your November with a 6-2 record. You've already made bowl eligibility, and basically at this point in the season is just make the Big 12 championship. And I think they got a decent chance of making it. Of course, with a 9-3 record, I mean, your chances are kind of mediocre. Of course, you got Baylor, who's going to be way up there, and then you got Iowa State too, so you can't forget about that. But I think you get an easy win over Kansas and TCU, and then I think that Iowa State game is going to be really close. And I think Texas gets the win there in the end, so that's going to be big for them to get a win over Iowa State. But that Oklahoma State to finish off the season, that game over there is going to be a tough one too. I mean, Oklahoma State's usually a pretty tough place to play. So for Texas, I think you got to watch out for that one, especially since, I mean, Oklahoma State next season, I expect to be a potential 8-9 win team as well. So I think those two teams are going to be pretty evenly talented, and they're going to have pretty even records, I think, for the majority of this season. And I think Oklahoma State has a bit of an advantage there because Texas, of course, they're coming into that game with a tougher stretch. Of course, Kansas and TCU, those are going to be both easy games, but that Iowa State game, I think, is going to be pretty impactful to that Oklahoma State game. It's just going to be tough in general to be able to get a win over Oklahoma State 1 week after you had a big, brutal game against Iowa State. So, yeah, record prediction for Texas next season is going to be 9-3, and this may be a bit underwhelming for you Texas fans, but once again, I mean, when you got Sam Ehlinger, I mean, he's going to be a great quarterback, but the thing is, though, is that you're losing two of your top receivers. And of course, losing Devin Duvernay, that's just going to be a really tough loss there, especially. And when you have a receiver that puts up over 1,000 yards in general, it's already going to be a huge loss. And of course, Devin Duvernay put up 1,400 yards last season, so it's going to be really tough for him to be replaced. So I think that's going to be very impactful for Texas. But all around, though, other than that loss there, I think Texas is looking pretty good as far as the returning production goes. It's just a matter of whether or not they can win their games. But once again, when you got a couple of really tough road games like with LSU, and that LSU game is very impactful for Texas. I mean, don't forget, like if Texas had an easy opponent as a non-conference game there, I mean, this Texas team could easily be 10-2 next season, no doubt. So, yeah, it's pretty risky having to have LSU in there. But all around, I still think Texas is going to have a good season. I mean, 9-3 is not a bad record at all. So that about wraps up our prediction on Texas. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below on this team. If you enjoyed this preview, be sure to slap a like on it, subscribe as well. It really helps out the channel, and I'd really appreciate that a ton. But yeah, as always, thanks again for watching. Be sure to stay tuned for more from All Sports Central. Once again, let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and I will see you all later.